Hello dear students. In last lecture we learned about history of Linux and open source software movement, and we have finished with this last point as a timeline of a Linux. So there are different versions. It has been started from v0.01 and to this v4 version, and there are so many distributions are available. For example, Debian distribution, Red Hat distribution, Gentoo, Ubuntu, CentOS, and so on. So there are lots of distributions are available with this Linux development. So this is a Linux structure. So before we should go with the Linux structure, I have used a word as a distribution. Okay, you may get confused. What is a distribution? Distribution means it is having a basic Linux kernel as it is, but the only thing that they are having a different features. So Red Hat will be having a different another layer of software around this kernel GNU set of software. Ubuntu will be having some different features than the Red Hat. So even in a Ubuntu it is having a home distribution, then it is having a server distribution, and so on. So distribution, it is nothing but, first of all, there will be a kernel, and along with the kernel there are some other softwares will be available, and these other softwares are according to the need of the customer, and this combination will form one distribution. And different developers, they have developed their own set of softwares and along with the same kernel. So this is Ubuntu. It is somewhat different than the Red Hat, but the functioning is the same one. Now Linux structure, this is the basic structure of any operating system. So first there is a hardware interact with the kernel interact with the shell and the commands. So this kernel, shell and commands, this is forming your operating system. So operating system, it is made up of basically mainly heart of an OS is a kernel. So kernel interacts with the hardware, and to interact with the kernel you have to use some interpreter in the form of the shell, that is a command interpreter, or you can interact with the GUI also. This is the basic structure. When at the first Linux, in case of Linux, it was totally developed only with the help of the command line interpreter. There was no GUI, and later on they have added the GUI. Now the next point from your curriculum, that is the Linux principles. So what exactly Linux is made up of? It's a core component, of course, that is a kernel. So kernel is basically, and along with the kernel there should be some set of softwares to deal with that kernel, and these softwares are taken from GNU. What is a GNU? GNU stands for GNU, G for GNU, and N for not, and U for Unix. So GNU, not Unix. This is an long form of the GNU. So this GNU containing so many open source softwares, and these softwares are combined with the kernel, and then it will make one OS, and that will become your Linux. Another principle, that it is a free and open source, freely available. Source code can be downloaded under this general public license. Even you can modify that source code, and you can transfer that source code to anyone, distribute that source code to anyone. Another feature of Linux is that it has a monolithic kernel. Last year you learned about different types of kernels, I think so. So it is just a revision: monolithic kernel, micro kernel, and hybrid kernel. So your Windows 10, you can take an example as a type of hybrid kernel, and in case of Linux it is using a monolithic kernel. Now what is a monolithic kernel? Monolithic kernel means all the kernel as well as device driver component, inter-process communication component has been integrated within the kernel itself. So we will see the next slide. It shows basic difference between monolithic kernel and the microkernel. Left side picture shows monolithic kernel. You can see here kernel space, it is very bigger one. It is containing its kernel, as well as that is a fundamental process management, IO management, device management, inter-process communication, and file software. So all these system softwares are within this kernel space. And if you see the microkernel means it's very small one. That's why it's called as a micro means smaller, so smaller kernel. And other parts, that is a file system handling, process handling, then your device drivers handling, interprocess communication, this is a part of the user space. So this kernel part has been minimized, and other functionality to interact with this users has been separated, and it has been part of the user space. That is a basic difference between monolithic kernel and microkernel. Its name is suggesting that mono means a single kernel having everything within that kernel. Everything means file system, IO process communication, IO devices communication, process management. Microkernel means only a small kernel. It is a separate entity, and other parts to communicate with the users has been separated out. That is a microkernel. And when we combine this monolithic kernel and microkernel, that will become a hybrid kernel. So your task is that what you have to find out from the net, what is in a hybrid kernel, what is in microkernel, write down the working of hybrid kernel, working of microkernel, and find out the examples of monolithic, microkernel and the hybrid kernel. Just I told you that monolithic, one example is a Linux. Okay, it is very big kernel having every component, every software uh, within that kernel. And microkernel, just I told you, you have to find out hybrid kernel, write into your as an assignment, so you will get an idea about the different kernels, and find out whether the Windows 10 it is in a hybrid kernel, microkernel or monolithic kernel. So it's your task. Now let's go back. Principle, it has a monolithic kernel, then its a kernel is preemptive. Now everyone of you know about the preemptive scheduling that you learn in scheduling chapter of operating system. So what is a preemptive? Preemption means, suppose there are two processes are running, one process is running and another process entered into the memory, and this another process, it is having a high priority. Then what will happen? Another process will preempt this running process, so running process has to stop, and the second process will get that processor, and that will be get executed. So that is an example of the preemption. So this kernel, it is supporting a preemption. Means suppose there are two or three processes are running, and one process came in which is having highest priority among all the processes, then the process which is running having a low priority will be removed from the processor, and the high priority process will be entered. It will get the processor, it will get executed, complete the execution, and then the next processes will be continue with the execution. So that is about the preemption. I think we have revised this preemption. So we will go further. Its kernel does not differentiate between threads and the normal processes. So it will treat threads as it is and the normal process as it is. Process and threads it treats as an equal. Then it includes a command line interface and also include a graphics user interface. So it is supporting for command line interface. Just I told you about the shell. There will be a command interpreter where you can enter a command and you can get a result from that command. For example, suppose you want to find out which are the different files are present into your operating system, into this hard disk, sorry. So what you will do, you will type ls command, ls small letter, and press enter on that command interpreter. Then you will get the result of different files, directories which are present within this root directory. It also supports the graphics user interface. That suppose I want to use GUI through, means I want to look the different files using GUI, clicking on the different folders of hard disk, then that is also possible. So it is supporting for the both command line interface as well as for the graphics user interface. In Linux, everything is considered as a file. Yes. So in Linux, first there will be a root and directory, and in a root directory there are different directories. For example, boot directory, for example device directories, that we will come to next point, file system. So everything is a file. So there will be a main file. That file is divided into different files, and again their functionality, and that every file again containing some data in the form of the files itself. So these are some Linux principles. So what we learn in this point, Linux is a free and open source. Anyone can download the source code, anyone can share that source code, anyone can modify that source code. It contains kernel and GNU softwares. GNU stands for GNU, not Unix. It is not differentiate between thread and the normal processes. Its a kernel is monolithic or microkernel. Its a kernel is monolithic. Monolithic means this kernel includes everything, every component. Along with the kernel, all the process management, device management functionality is included within that kernel. It includes or it supports for CLI, that is a command line interface. Also it is supporting for the GUI interface, graphics user interface. And Linux is everything is considered as a file. Okay, just I told you about monolithic and microkernel. Move to the next one. Okay, the next point from your curriculum. Comparative study with the other OS. So in this point, we are going to learn differences between Linux and Unix and differences between Linux and Windows. So first we will see about difference between Linux and Unix. So Linux, it is actually, they have taken the concept from the Unix itself. So there are so many similarities, but along with that there are some differences also. That this Linux inspired by the Minix, which was developed by the Andrew Tenenbaum, and this Linux, who developed this Linux? Linus Torvald. So Linus Torvald developed this Linux in 1991, and it is one of the concept of open source software. Unix, it is derived at laboratory AT&T, Bell Laboratory, by Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. Okay. So it is written in a C language. Linux is written in a C language. Unix also written in a C language. OS family Unix. Okay, it is derived from the Unix. So Unix family is also Unix and Linux also Unix. Working, yeah, both are currently in a working state. Source model, open source. Linux has taken an open source model. In case of Unix, it is a mixed one. Actually, Unix having a closed concept. Traditionally, it has been developed for a particular organization for an academic purpose. But later on, they have merged with the concept of the open source. So we can say it is a mixed one. Then initial release 1991, and here in a 1971 to 73 almost. In case of Unix. In case of Linux, it is derived in 1991. Unix 1970s. Then kernel type, monolithic kernel, just we have seen. And in case of Unix, it varies. Means previously it was monolithic, then they have changed to microkernel, and then hybrid. Then licenses, GPL, that is a GNU license, and V2 means a version 2. It's a license varies as it is it was proprietary actually, so it's a license are different one. It's an official site where we can get kernel, that is an official site. Default user interface is Unix shell in case of Linux, and in case of Unix that is a command line interface. Then text mode interface, bash shell, it is a default shell, and here a Bourne shell, it is a default shell in case of Unix. Actually first shell was a Bourne shell. Later on, up to this Linux development, bash shell has been developed. So they have taken the bash shell as a default one in case of Linux, and in case of Bourne shell as in for Unix. uh, examples, these are some examples: Debian, Ubuntu, Red Hat, Android.